Welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology. The next system we're going to be having a look at is the respiratory system. So the primary function of the respiratory system is for ventilation and respiration, so moving air in and out of the lungs, and for gaseous exchange between the lungs and the circulatory system. In the next few slides, we'll have a look at the structures and functions of the upper and the lower airways, the different muscles involved in respiration, the process of ventilation, and the definition and process of respiration. So having a look at the structures of the upper airway, we'll first have a look at the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity starts at the nostrils over here, or what's also known as the nares, and moves through this big cavity section and over these divisions in the nasal cavity called the turbinates, right round to the back of the nasopharynx over here and to the back of the oropharynx. So the nose or nasal cavity has very specialized cells within it to provide us with our sense of smell, but it also has specialized cells which secrete lots of mucus, and they have hairs on them called cilia, and these mucus secreting cells and the cilia covered cells help to filter the air that we breathe in, to warm it, humidify it, so that the air that reaches our lungs is clean and warm. Then we have the oral cavity, which consists of the teeth, the lips, the tongue that takes up the majority of the space in the oral cavity, the hard palate, the soft palate, and then we have some salivary glands situated in different areas. So I just want to draw your attention to this very large object, the tongue, inside the oral cavity. So primary function of the tongue is so that you can sense your taste and texture of the food that you eat and the fluids that you drink. And its other function is that it protects the airway during swallowing, and it ensures that any food or fluid bolus actually goes down into the esophagus and that we don't choke every time we have something to drink or to eat. The tongue manages to do this with aid of a structure called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is situated just at the back of the pharynx over here at the base of the tongue, and it's a leaf-shaped cartilage structure. And the way that it works is when you go to swallow a food or a fluid bolus, is the tongue pushes to the back of the oral pharynx. It presses upon the epiglottis, which acts like a trapdoor and closes off any access to the windpipe over here. And this ensures that any type of bolus moves down the esophagus in the direction towards the stomach. Simultaneously, the soft palate moves upwards during swallowing, and this just prevents any bolus from going up into the nasal cavity, which, as you can imagine, could be pretty uncomfortable. The only downside to the position of the tongue and the epiglottis is that when somebody becomes unconscious, and particularly when a patient is laying supine or on their back, the tongue completely relaxes, and as it does this, it moves to the back of the airway and it can close off the airway and access to the trachea, which means that despite anybody's respiratory effort or trying to breathe, there would be a blockage in the upper airway and air wouldn't be able to move from the oral or nasal cavity down to the lungs where it's needed. So it can have a detrimental effect to the unconscious patient lying on their back, and it's the primary suspect in an upper airway obstruction of an unconscious patient. Just underneath the epiglottis, this area is called the glottic opening, and this is what divides the upper airway from the lower airway. Moving on down to the lower airway, we have the trachea running down here, and you can see the trachea is surrounded by these rings of cartilage the whole way along. These rings of cartilage is what keeps the trachea open. It keeps its structure and its shape and its position on the neck going down into the chest. and it prevents the airway from closing in on itself. And if you have a feel at your own throat, you can actually feel these different rings of cartilage as you feel right down. Then we have the left and the right hand side of the lungs. The lung on the right hand side has 3 lobes and is larger than on the left hand side, which only has 2 lobes to it. The reason why the left lung is smaller than the right is because of the position and the size of the heart. So the heart lies right here in the center of the chest, but moves off to the left hand side, which occupies quite a bit of space where the lung would otherwise be. And that's what's led to the left-hand lung being smaller than the right-hand lung. So where the trachea moves down and joins into the lungs, this is where the trachea then branches into what's called the bronchi or the bronchus, the left and right bronchus, and breaks down into smaller airways called the bronchioles. And in this tree-like or root-like structure that's formed, as these airways get smaller and smaller and smaller, they lead all the way down to the bottom over here, which is called the alveolar or alveoli sacs. And it's only right down in these smaller airways, down in the alveolar sacs or alveoli, that gaseous exchange actually occurs. So if you think about the rest of the airway as just being conduit pipes directing and moving air right down to these smaller airways where the gases can finally exchange. The alveolar sacs are a very thin-walled structure, and because they're only 1 to 2 cells thick with the membrane surrounding it, this is a perfect site for gaseous exchange to occur. So each alveoli is surrounded by a capillary network, and when we breathe in, gases move all the way down to these alveolar sacs, and air is then able, or oxygen is able to move across the membranes into the capillaries, and that's what oxygenates our blood. So having a slightly closer look at the lungs, we've already mentioned that the principal function of the respiratory system, and in particular the lungs, is for ventilation, which is the movement of air in and out of the body, and respiration, which is the exchange of gases down in the alveoli, between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. The left and the right lung is separated by the mediastinum and its contents, so that's the heart and the great vessels, and you can see in the diagram to the right hand side that there's a nice big space right in the center of the chest, slightly moving off to the left hand side over there, and that's where the heart and the great vessels lie. The apex of each lung, so the very top portion of the lung, extends quite high during respiration. So when we take a nice deep breath in, the top of the lung can actually extend to about 2.5 centimeters above the clavicle or the collarbone over here. So the lung moves very high up when we're taking a deep breath, and each lung is cemented or attached onto the diaphragm, which is one of the major muscles of respiration. So surrounding each of the lungs, we have a double membrane called the pleural membrane. And if you remember back to the section on the cardiovascular system, we also had a double membrane surrounding the heart, which was called the pericardium. And just like it surrounded and protected the heart, so the pleural membrane surrounds and protects the lungs. The pleural membrane, the double membrane, has some serous fluid within the membrane or within that pleural cavity, and this serous fluid allows for an easy gliding and movement of the lungs during expansion and relaxation. Now, we have 2 membranes that we need to remember, well, 2 names of the membranes we need to remember. The visceral membrane, which is attached right onto the lung tissue itself, which then doubles back on itself to form what's called the parietal membrane or the parietal pleura. Now, this parietal pleura attaches onto the inside of the thoracic cavity and connects the lung tissue to the inside of the ribs and the thoracic cavity and onto the base of the diaphragm. And because this pleura is attached onto the lung tissue itself and onto the interthoracic cavity and the diaphragm, it has a very vital and important role in ventilation, because then as the diaphragm moves and the ribs move outwards, they tug or pull on the pleural membrane, which then helps the lungs to expand as we breathe in and then relax again as we breathe out. And this is just another diagram of the pleura surrounding the lungs. So you can see the dark purple color is the visceral pleura, which actually is so connected to the lung that it goes into every single fold and lobe around the lung tissue. It then doubles back upon itself in this brighter pink color, which is indicating the parietal pleura. And the parietal pleura is attached right onto the inside of that thoracic cavity, so running along the inside of the rib cage and onto the diaphragm. So if you can just visualize that as the lungs or the chest moves outwards and the diaphragm moves down during breathing, as it moves, it would pull the pleura along with it, and that would also cause a pulling and a movement of the lung tissue itself. Having a look now at the muscles involved in respiration, because we need the thoracic cavity to move in order for the lungs to move. So there needs to be some quite large and distinct muscular movement in order for that to happen. So the primary muscle of respiration is the diaphragm over here. And you can see the diaphragm extends down from the side of the thoracic cavity all the way up to the xiphoid process, or the base of the sternum, and down again. The diaphragm is a very large muscle, and it's a dividing muscle too. It divides the thoracic from the abdominal cavity. So it keeps all the abdominal and intestinal organs in its place, and it keeps all the organs of the thorax in their place too. And the diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscle, and when it is stimulated to contract when we need to breathe in, the diaphragm moves down, and as it moves down, it pulls along with it the base of the lungs over here and expands them. And then we have the intercostal muscles. So they're also one of the primary muscles of ventilation, and they're the muscles that are in between each and every one of our ribs. And you can see from a cross section over here, there's a rib muscle. And when these muscles contract, they pull the ribs together, which pulls the chest outwards and upwards, and this expands the thoracic cavity out and up. Then we have a few other muscles involved in respiration. So the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles are working primarily during normal respiration. And then if we need to increase our respiratory efforts to meet any metabolic needs, so if we've just gone for a good run, we've done some cardiovascular exercise, or even if we've gotten fright from something and our breathing rate increases, or we're having difficulty breathing because of some sort of medical condition, these other muscles involved in respiration can activate in order to help expand the chest and get in as much oxygen as needed. So one of the first ones is the sternocleidoid mastoid muscle. This muscle extends from the back or the base of the head over here down in the anterior of the neck, and it attaches onto the top of the sternum and the clavicles. And when this muscle contracts, it helps to lift that thoracic cavity or thoracic cage to just give it a bit more movement and expansion. The pectoral muscles across the chest attaching into the arm also can expand to pull the thoracic cavity more laterally and expand it that way. The pectoralis minor muscles also attach onto the top of the few ribs over here, or the first few ribs, and also help to lift and expand that chest. And then the next big one that we'll mention is the abdominal muscles. Abdominal muscles you will very commonly see, particularly in use when people are laying down, and also in children and babies. They're said to be more abdominal breathers. So you see lots of movement in the abdomen. The definition of ventilation is the movement of air in and out of a space. And when it comes to breathing, we classify it or call it ventilation because it's the process in which air moves in and out of the lungs. So air moving into the lungs or breathing in is called inspiration or inhalation. And when we exhale or breathe out, it's called expiration or exhalation. The amount of times that somebody ventilates in 1 minute is called a respiratory rate. And as medics, we need to count the respiratory rate very regularly. It's one of the vital signs that we need to take repetitively when managing a patient. And the way in which we do this is if somebody has quite a regular respiratory pattern, we'll only count how many ventilations they take in the space of 15 seconds, and we'll times that number by 4 so that we'll get how many respirations or ventilations have occurred within the space of 1 minute. We have a few respiratory rate ranges here according to age that we'll just have a look at quickly so that you have an understanding of what's normal for certain age groups. Newborns up until the age of about 1 month old are called neonates, and the respiratory range for them is anywhere between 40 to 60 breaths per minute. The infant, which is 1 month to 1 year, has an average respiratory rate of about 30 to 40 breaths per minute. The toddler, which is 1 to 2 years of age, has a regular respiratory rate of about 25 to 35 breaths per minute. The child has a respiratory rate of between 15 to 30 breaths per minute. Now, the child covers off quite a big range of age groups. So that's anywhere from 2 years up until a young adult or teenager. And once somebody is an adult, so above the age of usually 16 years of age, they would have a respiratory rate of approximately 10 to 20 breaths per minute. Now, you'd notice that the newborns and infants have much higher and faster respiratory rates than that of an adult, and that's purely based on the fact that their lungs have such a small capacity versus what adults have. So in order for the newborn to meet its metabolic needs, it just has a very, very fast respiratory rate. And as somebody grows and their lung capacity gets bigger and bigger and bigger, so their respiratory rate starts to decrease until you get to an adult's respiratory rate of between 10 to 20 breaths per minute. So this is a range, and again, this is the normal for someone who is at rest. So anything above or below these respiratory rates would either be having a very fast respiratory rate, or what's also called tachypnea, so fast breathing, or anything below these respiratory rate ranges would be called a slow respiratory rate or a bradypnea. The process of inspiration is triggered by an increase in carbon dioxide in the bloodstream or a decrease in oxygen in the bloodstream, which is detected by the brain. The brain then sends a signal down the spinal cord to the intercostal muscles in the diaphragm, telling it to contract and for us to take a breath in. So firstly, the intercostal muscles are stimulated to contract, and when they contract, the chest moves up and out. As the diaphragm is stimulated to contract, it moves downwards, and these two movements together cause an increase in the thoracic cavity. So as the chest expands, the interthoracic cavity so expands too, so the volume increases. And as that volume increases, so the pressure inside the chest actually decreases. And when we have a decrease in the pressure inside the chest, or the interthoracic pressure, air is then able to move from outside or in the atmosphere down through our windpipes and into the lungs to try and equalize the pressure outside the body and the pressure inside the body. And that's the process of inspiration or breathing in. During the process of expiration, the signal that was being sent from the brain causing the muscles to contract now ceases or stops. And as soon as that signal stops, we have relaxation of the muscles. So the intercostal muscles relax, and this causes the chest to move back or recoil to its original size. The diaphragm muscle relaxes and it now moves upwards. So when all these muscles relax, we have a decrease in the size of the thoracic cavity. And when the volume or the size decreases, this results in a rapid increase in interthoracic pressure. And now, because the pressure inside the chest is higher than that of outside, we have a movement of air from inside the lungs to the outside until we have equal pressures both inside and outside. The last process that we'll discuss is the process of respiration. So just to reiterate that ventilation is the movement of air in and out of the body, and that's achieved by inspiration and expiration. And respiration is the exchange of gases, so of oxygen and carbon dioxide between an organism and the environment. There are two types of respiration which occur. The first is external respiration. So this is the transfer of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. So oxygen is moving from the alveoli into the bloodstream. Carbon dioxide is moving from the bloodstream into the alveoli so that we can cause oxygenation of our blood. The second type is internal respiration. So this is where gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide are transferred between the peripheral blood capillaries and the tissues. So that's where oxygen is moving from the blood into the tissues and carbon dioxide is moving from the tissues into the bloodstream to be returned to the heart. That concludes our introduction to the respiratory system. The next system we will have a look at is the nervous system. If you have any questions regarding what I've just gone through, please don't hesitate to contact us.